This is Roth. I am here with Eric. Welcome to our Game of Thrones show, Dragons on the Wall. Slightly different name, same show, now with dragons.
Because dragons make everything better, right?
Dragons do make everything better, but I may get distracted thinking about dragons here and there. Especially this
beautiful... It's a problem.
It is an issue. This dragon's got grayscale, which is a little sad for it. Let's dive in here to this episode. Episode 3 of season 5. Hi, Sparrow, in which we meet Jonathan Pryce. Highlights for you of the episode. Did you like it? How did you feel that it measured up against the first couple of the season?
I did like it. I mean, I think for whatever reason, the thing that jumps out to me the most is kind of the realization that Sansa is intended to be with Ramsay, because holy crap, Sansa, get away from that situation.
That is a big moment. I want to talk about that. My overall impression was, wow, we haven't had much nakedness and sex and brotheling this season. I'm glad we've made up for that.
Yeah.
There was plenty of that to go around all across.
There was brothels in every corner of the land.
Every corner of the land. But let's talk about that, because I think that was probably a pretty shocking moment for a lot of viewers.
Yeah.
Not the nakedness. The Sansa and Ramsay.
Yeah.
Let's talk about where her character is right now that she would agree to that.
I mean, first and foremost, though, of course, we should say none of the characters realize what a monster he is.
No.
You know, he has managed to kind of hide that side of himself.
And I think that they really want us to know that, because they give Littlefinger that line of like, I know very little about you. That's odd for a lord. And they give us a reason why he doesn't know. Right.
And because we know enough to know Littlefinger would not give Sansa over to a guy as horrible as Ramsay at this point.
Yeah.
Because of, you know, his own creepy fascination with Sansa would not let him do that. But of course he is a player and schemer in the Game of Thrones, and so again, it's all positioning and titles, and the fact that this would be a good arrangement to sort of further everything and further his position, further Sansa's position. And so yeah, I think her going along with it is simply, as we've talked about, her now actively playing the game, and the fact that she can't sort of go back to what her old life was by being Sansa Stark, you know, the daughter of the Lord of Winterfell, but this is another way in, you know, to rise up.
Yeah, this is an avenue in, and it's a really bitter pill for her to swallow. I did love the sort of moment where she stops
when the two of them are standing there,
and when, you know, you can tell everything that she's thinking about him, and she doesn't. I think she doesn't mind that he knows.
No,
and then it's smiles and courtesy, because it's all a charade, you know, and it's charade. And but it's like she and Littlefinger have made this agreement, like, look, no longer be a bystander to tragedy, because the fact is, and you've learned it by now, tragedy is going to happen.
Yeah, because you're on Game of Thrones.
Because you're on Game of Thrones, and that's how we roll. But if you can take agency in your own life, if you can be active in making these choices, if you can decide that you're going to do this not because you're forced into it, but because you know 10 steps from now that you're going to slit this guy's throat and everything's going to be okay again, it may not be literally that, I sort of hope it is, then let's work the steps to get to that point where you can have your revenge.
Yeah.
But let's do it in a way that's smart and realistic.
The long con.
Let's play the long con, and he's really playing the very long con here, because, you know, even the point that he makes to Bolton is like, you think that we're powerless against the crown, against the Lannisters, but look at what a small group of people and a small team up between the North and the Arya did before.
Yeah. Even you know, once we said, look, once they revealed that he was behind like the murder of Jon Arryn that began the series, it's like the long con thing. It's like, this is a guy who really wants to rise in power, but knows better than to try everything at once in a world where that can get you killed very quickly. And so yeah, and he obviously, every single thing hasn't worked out the way he wants it to, but a lot has, because he's moved slowly. Yeah. And, you know, made his moves very deliberately.
And obviously he is, as we've seen, still communicating with Cersei, and he's, you know, playing that game as well. They, you know, she certainly doesn't know where he is or what he's up to. Yeah. But that'll be interesting to see him try and play both, navigate those waters heading back
Yeah,
to
yeah.
King's Landing. It's a big move.
It's
a huge, huge, huge event in the series for that character and for everybody.
Yeah.
So a fascinating part of the show. Let's talk about Tyrion a little bit. Speaking of whores, he's not the whore.
Speaking of whores, that's a transition you can use so much talking about Game of Thrones, though. That's the great
We
thing.
weren't speaking of whores. Just to clarify, I don't think that Sansa is a whore at all.
Littlefinger is.
Littlefinger, however, we have more questions about.
Yeah, I mean, you know, the big thing, kind of cutting to the chase there, is Jorah, them coming across each other, which didn't end up so well for Tyrion, but because, again, Dany has been so separated from the other characters, you know, and obviously Sir Barristan, him coming over was the first time that it was like, oh, someone from the Winterfell world, not Winterfell, Westeros world has come here. So now, you know, we're excited about the idea of Tyrion and Dany meeting. If we get that or not this season, at least Jorah, who's now been ostracized, but obviously is this huge connection to Dany, him finding Tyrion's a big deal, you know, to bring those two stories together.
It is, and I think that they set up some interesting groundwork prior to that. I mean, I did find it fascinating that Tyrion could not sort of see it through with the actual whore. Because that says a lot about where he's at psychologically and the depth of the wound of the betrayal that he just experienced.
Yeah, yeah. He's got bad whore memories.
He does have bad whore memories.
Yeah. His daddy whore issues
his daddy whore issues, they run it deep. But Jorah too, it's interesting because if you see like the ladies dressed up as Dany running around, I don't think he liked that very much.
No.
I think he had some pretty mixed feelings about that. But he saw an opportunity, you know, and Varys was right. Don't get out of here. Like, you're hidden. You're so...
Oh, no, sorry, finish your thought.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say that the Dany horror reminded me, though, this was actually interesting because we were seeing in many different ways how Dany's legend is growing. And it can be fetishized, like having a prostitute dressed like her in that sort of iconic blue dress, or it can be just someone preaching about her, you know, and actually literally talking about her and what she represents.
The follower of the Lord of Light.
Yeah. So it's
who saw Tyrion.
Right. Because in Westeros, we do get these mentions of Dany here and there, but now that, you know, Tyrion has traveled closer to her, but not all the way, you're kind of seeing that this...
How her legend emerges. And of course it is. I mean, think about, for all of the obvious reason, her legend is growing larger and larger.
She's got dragons.
She's got dragons.
Yeah.
But it's getting almost larger than, like her dragons. I just thought of this analogy now.
Yeah.
But like her dragons, it's getting too big for her to control.
Sure.
You know, it's unmanageable at this point and probably pretty dangerous even to her, you know. That's interesting. What a point, Eric. That's absolutely true. But yeah, he sees an opportunity to maybe try and get in her good graces. She's not the forgiving sort, as we know. So that's an interesting setup for both of them.
Yeah. Now, let's talk about other people who aren't forgiving, though, which is Cersei. And let's talk about her and Margaery, because some interesting stuff's going on there.
I was just saying to you,
the young man caught in the middle.
The young man caught just where he'd like to be right now. I would like to do this forever and ever. And
yes.
Let's talk about that. I don't know where to go first. Let's first talk about the sex, and we'll talk about the girl fight next.
Well, okay, look, let's just get out of the way that it's weird and funny because we've got an actor who in real life is 17 now, might have been 16 when he was shooting this, with Natalie Dormer, who's 33 now, might have been 32 when she saw this. It just couldn't have been the worst day for him. I'm just saying.
It was. I felt like
get in bed with naked Natalie Dormer.
That was some method acting going on there. That was some method acting.
He's like, I just want to shoot this scene forever and ever.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because I'm glad in this particular case, it's one of the cases that I'm really glad that they have aged the characters.
Right.
Because
and they don't say Margaery's age at all, by the way.
They don't
just said the actress's age, but
Yeah.
it's like Margaery could be. I think no matter what, she's supposed to be older than him.
Yeah.
But Natalie Dormer looks like she could pass for 25 anyway. So
I found their bedroom scene last season horrifically disturbing and upsetting, and just really, really gross with like little Sir Pounce By the way, that Sir Pounce is like the
not
most
returned this season.
extraordinary cat in the universe because he survived Joffrey,
Yeah.
who you would think was repeatedly trying to kill him.
Sir Pounce had like 10 siblings that did not make it.
That did not make it,
Yeah.
sadly, but we won't talk about that. So yeah, I mean, I found it still disturbing because of the age difference.
Yeah.
But a little more palatable. Like I imagined that he was 18, even though he's certainly not.
Yeah, and it's just, I don't know, it's like, it's just in this world, everything is about control and power, and you get the feeling that Margaery is maybe fond of this kid.
Fonder than Joffrey.
Yeah. You know, probably in no way loves him, but it's like he's a sweet kid who's in over his head with everything going on. But at the end of the day, she's with him for a certain reason. And now the power play she's using with Cersei, with his mom, which gets disturbing again because she's purposely toying with her by talking about having sex with her son.
Well,
and basically being like, I've supplanted you because I'm like now the important woman in his life, you know?
Yeah, I want to talk about that. I think that Margaery is a fascinating character. It's interesting because I know someone that detests her worse than anybody else on the show, which I find fascinating because it's like, really? Because there's a lot of terrible people. But it's because she is such a skilled manipulator in the sense that she very wisely uses what is a maxim for others, which is you catch more flies with honey, you know? She knows how to woo people onto her side, which I think is...
Even Joffrey,
which I think is ultimately going to be very much more to her benefit, you know, than using fear tactics and terror. She knows how to get the people on her side and how to get Tommen on her side.
Well, that wasn't too hard to figure out.
That was an easy one for her.
Yeah.
That wasn't rough. But she's manipulating him very clearly and using, I adore your mother. Don't you think she'd be so much happier rather than going like the catty route?
Yeah.
But what I love...
Don't trash talk mom.
Don't you trash talk your mama. But no, I love her. This is in her best interest. What I really enjoyed was the scene between the two of them because the power dynamic had so obviously shifted from last season, and she once again was using, it was sort of the girl way of fighting.
Oh yeah.
And I say that with caution, only in the sense of, the men do it too, for sure. But the thing that you say the things that you deliver the message without saying the insult.
Oh yeah.
You know?
Oh yeah.
Oh, do I call you dowager? You're old.
Yeah.
You're done. You're out of here.
Yeah.
You're
the last generation. Yeah. I've come in now and taken your place. And yeah, they're both very pointed what they're saying to each other, but they both know to keep appearances.
Yeah.
You know.
And anything you need. There was such an air of desperation to it. I don't think she'll stay desperate for all that long. We see her sort of managing the small council until it's a small council of one, her.
The episode is called High Sparrow, so we should talk about the High Sparrow.
Let's talk about the High Sparrow. Now, these are really interesting, and we got some more nakedness here. With the Septon at the brothel playing the game of the Seven, which was, again, very disturbing.
Yeah.
But it's fascinating to bring in the element of fanaticism, religious fanaticism in this world, and what that would look like in this world that's so steeped in violence.
Yeah.
And her making the very pointed choice to go, you know what, I'm going to make an ally out of you because you can help me. It's a really dangerous ally to have. This is not someone that is motivated by the things that you can control, like money and power.
But his approach is interesting too, because we've seen his followers who are pretty like intense.
Yeah.
But he has a very, I guess the idea here being that he's a religious, a person that people would want to follow and has that charisma because he gives off the air of being kind of laid back, and it's Jonathan Pryce who's played like creepy villains, but being very sort of like, I'm just here, I'm helping people, you know. Cersei is interesting to see her approach because she is looking for new allies and a new way in because she is losing the power she had. So maybe it's interesting to see her ally with someone who's come in and could be a threat to some people, but she's like, oh, maybe this can be someone who can help me. Yeah,
let me arm you.
Yeah.
But he does sort of, you can understand why people would follow him in the sense that he is unlike this, unlike the Septon, he's living into his word, saying, I care for the poor, we're all equal, I'm going to give you my shoes, here's some soup. You would be much more inclined if you were of a religious mind, I think, to follow this guy than the one that's a total hypocrite. Yeah. And clearly so. So it's an interesting, it adds a new flavor to the world. Speaking of the many-faced god, which we weren't, but now we are, Arya.
Arya, yeah. We got to see her kind of in this new, her training. It was not a Rocky montage training. We got to see a little bit of her new world, which is, she's kind of being given sort of the grunt works right now. She's having some issues with another young woman. She had some colorful language.
She used the C word.
Yeah. You do not use the C word, but it's Arya. And that was kind of fun to see her.
Do you know who are you? You're about to find out.
I wrote down that line too. But it's kind of like right now she is getting sort of the Mr. Miyagi paint the fence.
She is getting the paint the fence treatment. Right. I've been sweeping this floor for days.
Right. Well, you just learned how to decapitate 5 people at once. Yeah.
What you'll learn soon is that's how you murder.
Yeah. Yeah.
I find the peek into this world very fascinating. The idea of truly abandoning your identity, which, as we've seen, she was mostly able to do, but she had to hang on to Needle.
Yeah, I mean, she got rid of it where she's staying, but she buried it pointedly. She did not discard of it. It's a place where she could get that sword again.
And think about the meaning of that sword. It's been her protector.
She lost it for a long time.
She lost it for a long time, but it's kept her safe. And then it was given to her, by her brother, who was the one person and the first person probably to see and accept the real her, without trying to force her to be a little lady. He was like, "Here's your sword. Go."
And then she was trained to fight with it by the first person who was really kind of like helping her in that way.
And her dad eventually allowed that and it sort of accepted that part of her.
Yeah,
it's got a lot of attachment and meaning. So it'll be interesting. That's an interesting choice for her to make in this world. I love seeing that side of it, but I do think that the idea, like the gods come up so often in these different beliefs and versions of the gods, which is not unlike our world, but the idea that like the many-faced God, there is only one God and every man knows his gift, I believe. If I'm missaying that, forgive me, but I was like, well, that's, death.
right.
Considering what they dole out.
Yeah. I mean, that's the art she is learning.
Yes, the art of murder.
Yeah.
So, Pod is going to be learning some arts himself.
Yes. Pod is. Brienne was kind of trying to push him away for a while, but now
Well, she's been hurt.
She's been hurt, and in fact, we learned a lot more about that. And it's interesting when they bring up characters from the past. I think it's easy to kind of forget about Renly. He wasn't on the show that much, but to Brienne, he's someone very important.
Right.
And that was our in.
When Renly showed up, I think in season 2, a lot of people were like, "Who's that again?"
Yeah.
And they were having trouble
because they mention these characters and they do pop up, and then some are gone very quickly.
Yeah.
So it was really interesting to get her reminiscing about him. A, because it brought up that character again, and B, because it was a very emotional story she told.
Yeah, it was. And I found myself, oddly enough, of everything that sort of happened in this episode, that's the one that got me. It's an interesting aspect of the show, is thinking about it, that sometimes people just telling the story of a pinnacle moment that helped make them who they are.
Yeah.
Tyrion had a moment like that with Jaime last season. This one for her told me so much about who she is and where that attachment and where that love for Renly comes from. I think obviously it's fueling that desire for vengeance, but you get it on a visceral level when you hear that kind of story. You could put yourself in her shoes of having that moment of, sort of exalted moment where you've pleased your dad and everything is possible, and then having it dashed like by cruel, mean teenagers. And then this guy came to your rescue.
Right.
I would be loyal to him forever too.
Yeah.
I might not.
And maybe have feelings for him even if he was not going to return them.
Yeah.
As we know that she did. Yeah.
But I'm loving her dynamic with Pod. I absolutely am. So that's some of the murder and nakedness of this week's Game of Thrones.
This week's Game of Thrones.
There was a little murder.
Yeah, but there was training for murder.
There was training for murder and talk of murder, which is good unto itself. We'll talk about that a little bit more. Let us know what you guys thought of this week's episode in the comments below, and where you think things are going from here. But don't do spoilers if you know where they're going.
Right. Don't be the jerk.
All right. We do have some social questions which will help us to discuss some topics. Actually, the first thing that I want to talk about that I think is pretty interesting is that a lot of people were really mad at our Khaleesi last week.
Yeah.
Which we even had a discussion about, did we think that was really sort of the smart political move? we didn't talk about Jon.
We haven't talked about Jon. We should talk about Jon.
We should definitely talk about Jon.
Yeah. Hold the social thought.
Hold the social flow.
Yeah.
Jon made a big choice this week that sort of mirrored what she did last week in terms of the execution, right? Making a choice to make a point with a public execution.
To be like, this is how I lead, this is how the rules go, and this is what we're gonna follow.
Yeah, and he was in a position, you know, as commander to exert his authority quickly and make some very pointed decisions. Now, he chose to keep his main enemy with him, and in fact give him an elevated position despite Stannis' advice to like get rid of that guy.
Right, but to follow the idea that this guy, while a jerk to him and his adversary, a danger to him, is very competent, a good fighter, someone who you get the idea that Jon maybe is like, he might hate me, but his loyalty is to the Night's Watch, and he will fight for the Night's Watch. I've seen that for myself.
Yeah.
But this other guy...
And it was a political decision, I think, too. It's like sort of when...
Because that guy had a lot of followers.
That guy had a lot of followers, and it's like, well, I'm not creating a war here. I'm still going to give him a position of power, and let's all work together, sort of an idea, which is a smart political move in a lot of ways. But then when he is openly defied...
Yeah, and someone's saying, I will not do what you asked me to.
Yeah, then he, as his father taught him to do, beheaded the man himself and sort of said to everybody, I am the commander. We are actively in a time of war, you know, despite what anybody may understand of what's going on. I know the dangers that we're facing. You can't argue with my orders.
Right.
There's just no question. And I will say that as a viewer, I felt in line with Stannis with a little nod, like, yes, that was the right thing to do.
Oh, yeah. Oh, no, I did. I definitely did. It was, I think, important that, like you mentioned, he did it himself, like his father, which is one of the very first scenes of the show. You know, it's like, don't make someone else do this thing. Own it yourself.
And that was a deserter.
Right. Own it yourself. Like, if you are sentencing this man to death, you do it yourself. It's your responsibility. And at the same time, it kind of puts the foot down, obviously, in a huge way, saying, look, this is what happens. You have to follow my order. We know Jon is not a cruel person, is not like looking to like it's, you know, is not looking to be a tyrant, but at the same time needs people to be loyal. And yeah, I liked how they played it, because when he paused, when the guy was begging for his life, I was like, I'm a coward. They make you think maybe he's just going to let him go and say, get out of here.
Mercy.
But it's like, nope. And you kind of know, I think the idea was in his mind, he probably for a second did think about it. Oh, should I let him go? And then he's like, no, I can't.
And he really couldn't, especially at that point. He couldn't have taken it that far and then backed off.
Yeah, especially because this is his first test as a leader. You know, it's like, this is really, everyone's going to look how he handles this. And while he might get a few people saying, oh, he did the right thing, too many people would have been like, no, he's weak. You know, even if they were glad he didn't kill the guy, they still might think like, oh, he's weak. You know?
Exactly, and he's already in a vulnerable position. And he can't afford to be in a more vulnerable position. And honestly, for the sake of his men, he can't afford to have them arguing with his orders. Right. Because they are in very vulnerable positions. He needs them to do what he tells them to do. Yeah. Now leave in comments what you think of the show.
And there will be a connection here.
And there will be a connection very shortly. All right, so we've been talking about Jon and whether or not he sort of made the right decision to execute the Defier. Yeah. And we agree that he did. Yeah, you know, I mean, sort of he had to make that statement. But it's interesting to me that it is such a mirror for the execution that took place with the Khaleesi last week. And almost universally from the people that I saw some amazing texts between some friends of mine that were watching it live, arguing about whether she did the right thing or not. One said yes, one said no. But I feel like most people felt like she didn't. Right. Do you think it's interesting that, and I agree, I don't think she did. I thought it was a bad political move, especially to do it publicly. Yeah. That one was right and one, there's such similar cases. They are
similar cases, but it's I think it's the know your audience question. Yeah. And so Jon was dealing with first of all, much smaller group. And it's a group that is the Night's Watch, you know? I mean, obviously, yes, Stannis is there and Stannis has his men there, but really at that moment, it's about the Night's Watch, who are all sworn to loyalty, who are all sort of like in the same place as soldiers together.
Yeah.
Whereas Dany was dealing with, I think basically thousands of people.
Yeah.
Citizens
that she had just recently freed,
who were looking at
Not
her.
all of them.
Yeah, but many of what she'd freed were looking at her in nearly religious manner, but did not have in any way a history with her or anything like that. So it's much more precarious, and you can understand how what Jon was doing was playing to the crowd in the right way.
Yeah.
Whereas Dany was doing something that was almost by its design going to repulse them, because they were so on board with, the fact that, you freed us, the people who were slave owners are awful, and that guy just was, helping by killing a slave owner.
Yeah, I have to agree. It's a very interesting, it's like a very fascinating parallel in that way,
Right.
because I think that for Jon, he had to show that kind of merciless strength in that moment, because if he didn't, he would be putting them in danger, himself in danger. They're already so vulnerable. There's not enough of them to fight what's coming. He doesn't have the right resources. He needs to maneuver and get them in position very quickly to be as defended as they possibly can be, and he cannot broker any argument. There's no way.
Right.
And I think that the men that are part of the Night's Watch, and that's the language they understand.
Definitely.
With Dany, Misa, they're calling her mother.
Yeah.
Mother of dragons, but their mother too. You don't want to think mom is all nasty and mean. And I mean, obviously she has to be.
Mom.
You suck, mom. But I think that they had started to, and we saw this last season, and this is what we were talking about earlier in terms of her mythology becoming dangerous to her.
Right.
They have started to deify her.
Yeah.
And not in the way of a harsh god either, like a very beneficent god who is the breaker of chains.
Yeah, who represents freedom to them, literally.
Who represents freedom. So for her to execute or have a slave executed publicly, a former slave executed publicly.
For killing a slave owner.
For killing a slave owner, it's like, that is not this audience right now. If you had to punish him, jail him.
Yeah.
If you had to do it behind closed doors. But you're making this statement, this very rigid statement about how the rules need to apply to everybody. Well.
And it's not people, these are like, again, thousands of people that don't know her. They only know her as the symbol of what she is. Whereas Jon is like with a much smaller group that he literally lives with. It's like, these are the guys he's like, sleeps next to, eats next to, and fights next to.
Yeah.
So it's like he much more understands the vibe of the group and what is the right move. Obviously, we can assume every single one of those people didn't agree with his decision.
No.
But the vast majority probably did, and why it was the right move with those guys. Yeah.
And even if they don't, they now get that if they're loud about it, they're going to get beheaded.
Right, exactly.
Immediately.
Whereas like Dany just has to, she really does have to think about it. She doesn't know these people, and that there's so many of them.
And she can't behead them all,
Yeah,
nor does she want to.
She was, and in a moment she did that, she was in danger, physical danger.
Physical danger, yeah. So that brings us to the next question, and we're not trying to make this an all Daenerys podcast, but it's, turning out that there are a couple of questions about her just based on last week's episode.
A special guest Emilia Clarke is here. No, she's not.
And don't do that to me. So Karen Petit says that she's a tyrant. She is now a tyrant in the making, which is really interesting because we talked, I think, in the preview episode about there's a friend of mine that has the theory that she's going to ultimately end up being, for lack of a better phrase, the big bad, that she will turn into.
Isn't that friend of yours, Jim Vivida, our coworker?
Oh my God, totally. I forgot who said it. And sometimes I try to protect people's anonymity, and sometimes I just don't remember stuff. It's Jim.
Yes.
Yeah, no, Jim.
I know that dude.
Yeah, Jim actually said that. Thank you. I totally forgot that. Jim said that he thinks she's going to turn out to be the big bad. And we had said that the only way that I think you agree, the only way I totally see that happening is if she gets high in her own supply and starts to believe in this myth that's been created about her.
Yeah, and I also think, I understand that idea of is Dany a tyrant in the making? I understand why you'd suggest that, but I also think on this show, everyone's a tyrant in the making.
Yeah.
Like everyone who is in any place of power. And will Sansa sort of succumb, who already is sort of climbing that ladder again in a very different way? Will she succumb to that and be a tyrant? And Margaery, all these people have different tactics.
Yeah.
Would Jon, now that he is being, sort of really looked upon as a leader, which is really great, and there's a heartwarming aspect to it for us because we knew who his father was and all that, but could he change over time? And I think on Game of Thrones the answer is yes, everyone could.
Yeah.
And maybe I shouldn't even say maybe, I bet by the end some will. I think that some characters will probably truly be corrupted in ways that might surprise us from who they were at the beginning.
I agree, but I think that she's certainly set up to be in one of the most unique positions for that to happen in terms of like the rest of them really don't have people worshiping.
No, because for her it does tie in with this religious fervor.
Yeah. And the fact that she has dragons, which there's so many people that are like, why can't you control your dragons? It's like, they're dragons.
You
like
freaking control your dragons.
Like dragons, I don't think are, I get that because I think that we were so invested in the idea of seeing her really be mother to these dragons and have them like sort of do her bidding and stuff like that. Can you imagine how easy it would to become a tyrant then? But they are uncontrollable beings. They are autonomous beings. I would like to see her learn to train her dragons, though.
Hey! Did you see Matt Fowler's tweet about how someone was not being imaginative when they named a dragon Drogon?
Yeah, Drogon. Yeah.
It'd be like naming your cat Cot.
That's a great name for a cat.
It is. It is.
Caught
the Cat. I'd watch the animated series.
I will confess that like I am invested in that relationship too, and I would like to see her be able to reunite with her dragons in a way that is beneficial to all people. Okay, so
and all dragons.
And all dragons. So finally, we have a question. A lot of people have also been saying nothing is happening this season. So Lee Moore says, "I just want something to happen this season." Is it too slow for you?
I mean, I'm going to repeat myself a little bit here, I know, as far as the big picture, which is, okay, we are now in the 2 books that frankly have the most issues of the books. And overall, I have to admit, I was disappointed by those 2 books, having just burnt through those first 3, and they're so great and so much leaves out to you. Those 4th and 5th books drag a lot, and there are weird tangents and things, and
dragging a lot.
And I do think it takes too long because he starts to introduce so many new elements. Now we're getting the sort of truncated, more sped up version of it. Now they're overlapping those books and making sure we're not leaving out characters who sat out the entire 4th book. But that being said, the story is at a place where it's less focused than before. Because while there is Dany's out there, and is she coming? But right now she's not. She's staying put. And everyone who might be gunning for the throne is doing so in very sort of discreet, like slow, we talked about the long con, those ways. It's not as exciting or sexy as there's a war and there's people out there fighting and there's Blackwater and all this stuff. So it is a slower part of the story.
And very murderous wedding.
Very murderous weddings, yeah. It is slower comparatively to what preceded it. I still find it intensely interesting and very fascinating to see these characters shifting. It's the source material, I will say, that does slow it down or make it less accelerated at this point, even though this is the faster version. So I can understand some frustrations, and I think that probably come from people who haven't read the books, which I understand is probably more people than have,
I feel like, I mean, basically I agree. I think that ultimately we're looking at the best they could do in terms of accelerating this, making it more, pop a little bit more, making it feel sort of more charged in terms of eventful and things just on the horizon, even with some of the changes they've made, which we'll quickly touch on one in a moment, one of the biggest changes that they've made. But ultimately, I am endlessly fascinated by both because I think that they're really great character studies. And I don't necessarily need these big events to keep me interested. I do want things to propel forward in terms of the story by next season. At which point, I do think that they'd have to get away from the books and really introduce some things that haven't happened yet, because I don't think that we can continue to just explore these psyches. That's not going to work for a television series for too long.
It won't, and I think it's very notable that the producers, Benioff and Weiss, keep saying they think it'll be about 7 years, because I think they know that's really what it should be. And I guess, HBO is already, no shock. HBO's like, well, we'd love it to go longer. And I feel like maybe the debate is probably between 7 and 8. I really don't think they want to go past 8 at all, the producers. And yeah, it's a TV show, and it should, I have my thing about, heavily serialized shows that I don't think in my dream world any should go past 5 years. But let's go 7. I think 7 is your sort of cutoff point to when it starts to drag on. And yeah, people want to get closure on that. This is a story that people want to see how it wraps up. They want to see who wins, even though I don't think it'll be that clean.
It's not going to be that clean. But the fact of the matter is, this is a story that started with an inciting incident that introduced the idea that there was going to be a lot of players vying for this throne. And many, many people were going to die in pursuit of it. And many, many lives were going to be changed in pursuit of it. But at the end of the day, there does need to be an answer. There does need to be a place that we were getting to.
And there's
even if it's the restart button on a whole new Game of Thrones.
Right. And look, I also think that this show is such a success that when Game of Thrones does end and they say 7 is it, there's going to be another show in this world. I almost guarantee it. We've even heard rumblings that they've talked to Martin about it. But yeah, you look at Dany, and this does come from the books. This issue that Dany, since the first book, is supposed to be heading to Westeros. We want her to get there. We want Arya to go through that list. She's gotten through a couple people, but we want her to finish the list. If you start with a list, you got to finish the list. You
do have to finish the list. And by restart button on Game of Thrones, I don't mean a whole new series. What I mean is basically once somebody wins, other people are going to be vying for that crown. Okay, so those are our thoughts on that. We do have to do one quick book discussion. I'm looking at our producer who is looking at me very angrily.
She's not looking angrily. Yes, this is our book spoiler warning.
Total book spoiler warning.
And you can stop right now because it's the last thing we're going to talk about if you haven't read the books.
Very quickly, we're going to just touch on this because it's a big discussion for readers. Frank says that bringing Sansa into Winterfell is way too much of a change from the books. I don't agree because I think the show needed this. This, I think, is the piece that feels most exciting to people. It's dangerous. It's unknown. We don't know what's going to happen. We're scared for her because if there was anybody in this world that was worse than Joffrey, who she was initially set to wed, it's Ramsay and his crazy, dangerous current girlfriend. And she's in a perilous situation. She's going to have to use every bit of her skills of manipulation to see herself through this situation. It is emotionally traumatic for her, and it gets us back to Winterfell, and it propels the story in a very compelling way. So I think it needed to happen.
I think so too. I mean, first of all, of course, Benioff and Weiss know more than we do about where the story is heading, first of all. So we always have to keep that in mind if they make a move like that, because we don't know, because the books Sansa's kind of stuck at a point in the books. And then again, kind of going back to what we were just talking about, you need some more forward propulsion. There is a place in the books where it starts to be like, all right, guys, having everyone spread out works for a while, but now it's time to bring things together. Sansa, they kind of stopped her story, and obviously he's going to continue it when he gets back to her, hopefully in the 6th book. But for the time being, with this being a TV show and having to go by different rules, she can't just sort of sit there out not doing anything. Bringing her back into Winterfell also is emotionally a good tie because it goes back to the beginning of the show when the Starks were all together, goes back to Ned Stark, the fact that it's corrupt that these people are even in Winterfell. And so I think it works very well. I know it's hard for people to put aside the books, but just looking at this show, I think it works very well to bring her back into there and see how her coming back so changed what she might do in this situation.
Absolutely, and he certainly is going to return to her because he released one chapter and it was about her. I think that there's, look, there were elements in the conversation in that chapter of the book that directly mirrored the conversation.
Very similar. I was going to say that earlier, that when you were talking about how she's working these guys, but it's different characters, but it's still the same idea.
It basically directly mirrored the advice that he gave her, which was, it was in terms of be active, you can do this. and using her wiles to some degree or another, or using her and her smarts, basically to manipulate a situation that feels out of her control. So there is a link, there's a thematic link in the two, obviously, and I'm guessing there's eventually going to be a story link between the two. Ramsay obviously does not marry her in the books. He marries the false Arya.
Right.
But something's going to happen.
Something's going to happen.
Something interesting is going to happen on the show, and we're looking forward to it. Let us know what you think in the comments below about everything and all things Game of Thrones, and return for more Dragons on the Wall soon.